complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. Like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Rory Duncan, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Hey, good. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased and honored to have piqued your interest, and I hope that I do yourself and your guests proud on your esteemed channel. So thank you, thank you.
I think that piqued my interest is perhaps an understatement. You've had a very interesting life, a very interesting story. And so, if you could you describe the conditions you grew up in, and then how that affected, your career in life? I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Well, we have a unique position in history as white Zimbabwean stroke Rhodesians because, I was born in 1966 in Salisbury, Rhodesia, in a city that is now Harare, in a country that is now Zimbabwe. And, it went from a colonial settler government, if you like, or a colonial government imposed upon a wild and relatively uncivilized piece of bush in the South Central Africa. And so the early years of our country was defined by very, very hard work and the very quick evolution of what was a tribal, traditional, African place into a modern society with cities and clubs and buildings and national sports teams and agriculture and mining, and all of that happened between 1890 and in 1980. So 90 years later, there was this well-established, incredible country, and I was born just at the beginning of the civil war in Zimbabwe, which raged from 1965 to 1980, where Rhodesia then was part and parcel of a Cold War. How would you say, affected by the scramble for Africa during the Cold War, where a lot of USSR versus the Iron Curtain versus the West, and it was that time, and of course then it turned into a black-white war. It turned into a revolutionary war for the majority. And so that was just a very, very interesting landscape in which to grow up, because for the first 15 years of my life, it was in the middle and through the entire Civil War. So against that backdrop, you have to understand that, we were very much a part of a group of people that were incredibly stubborn, and as Ernst van Zyl likes to say, Rhodesians were the only other white tribe in Africa to assimilate fully and identify as Africans. And as a result of that, our culture was quite unique, and our way of life was quite unique. It was strange because, war is an endless and continuum in tragedy. And so as young kids, we were used to listening with great attention every evening at 8 p.m. when the national news came on the television, and the first thing they would do is issue a communique of the names and places and deaths of people, who died in the war. And that was a daily thing. And then, of course, we grew up surrounded by arms of war, automatic weapons and pistols and revolvers and shotguns and bombs and landmines and helicopters and double-barreled machine guns and special forces and women and children carrying guns, landmine proof vehicles, and yet life still went on largely in the ordinary. So supermarkets were still open. Of course, Rhodesia was sanctioned, yet it was almost self-sufficient. So there was a strange juxtaposition of living in this reality that was extremely dangerous in the countryside, and yet everything functioned as if there was no war at all in the city. So we went to school and we lived in beautiful homes and in large acres of lawn, and we went to prestigious government schools that were had some of the best education systems developed in Africa. So there was that as a background. And then, of course, most of us were of farming stock. And as a result of that, we spent a lot of time in the countryside, either at family farms or our own farms, or at places like my grandfather on one side of my family was a miner. And so he used to run chrome mines in the remote bush, as well as mica mines and various other things. So we were always exposed to the outdoors and learned at a very, very early age to be extremely vigilant, and also were trained in the use of firearms and to be, in self-defense. So yes, it was certainly interesting.
So I've spoken with a number of South Africans, and they speak to sort of the unique heritage of the Boers, being, this sort of mix of, Dutch and French Huguenots, and always, in addition, right, there's the white Anglo population. Where do Rhodesians derive from? Is it a similar stock or a different one?
The great question. So my own blood, which is a fairly good representation of what formed us, is on one side is Van Kerk and Venter, which are both Afrikaans, Dutch, Holland-based, names. And those people in my family were relatively early settlers in the South African context, with this 1652 and onwards, and then there's a very small percentage of Griqua, which was a sort of bastard or a bastard tribe that evolved out of the early Khoi and Dutch coming together, and then on the other side, very British, with the Tathams and the Tullachs and the Moody's and people like that. So there's a big cross section of blood in there, and that can be said safely for the majority of people that evolved into being Rhodesians. So a mixed bag, but the culture was very British. Of course, Cecil John Rhodes and his people ensured that,
So you mentioned growing up during the war, and I've had a conversation with Thomas, who's certainly American, but a scholar of the Cold War, about the war that happened in South Africa right before the government changed. And that war was very much, from what it sounds like, an insurgency. Was Rhodesia similar, or was it a government war with formalized armies? And from that, were civilians respected, or was there a reason that everyone needed to be armed at all times?
Yeah, good question. So the Rhodesian army was comprised of a national call-up, in other words, compulsory military duty for every white child or man from the age of 16 upwards, and the only way you got out of joining the formal military at 16 by conscription was if you had good enough examination results at your O levels, as we called them, in order to qualify for further education. But if you flunked that at 16, you went to the army. For the black population, participation in the Rhodesian army was a voluntary base. It was on a voluntary basis. But interestingly, the Zimbabwe Special Forces, the much feared and respected Zulu Scouts, for example, were predominantly black, probably 60% or more. So there was a formal army, highly trained and very motivated, relatively well equipped with ancient materials and machinery, old French helicopters and the like. So the Rhodesian army was pretty formal. And then the insurgency, which it was, happened from two sides and was split on tribal lines. The majority tribe in Zimbabwe is called the Mashona tribe, or the Shona speaking peoples, and that was Robert Mugabe, who eventually became the president. And they were called Zanla, the Zimbabwe National Liberation Army. And they were backed largely by China, and they operated out of Mozambique. And so their training camps were on the eastern side of Africa, in Tanzania and in Mozambique. And most of their entry into Rhodesia at that time was through the eastern border, and then in through to the rest of the country. And then the Matebele people, the Ndebele speaking people in the south and the west of the country, were backed largely by Russia, and they had their training camps and safety was granted to them by the Zambians. And they were actually fighting the same enemy, but almost totally separate from each other along tribal lines. So yes, it was a very interesting dynamic.
So obviously Rhodesia fell. What was the transition from one government to another like, both sort of on the broad political scale and then for you and your family personally?
Well, it was bizarre. It was weird. There was a lot of fear of reprisal and vengeance. A lot of people left. We had various phrases for that. We used to call it the chicken run. They took the gap, or they did the chicken run. But a lot of people left. I think we had a minority population of white people of European descent of maybe 500,000, 460,000 people at the height of Rhodesia by 1979, let us say 1980, and a lot of people left in the very early part of independent Zimbabwe after the independence on 18th of April 1980. But then a large percentage stayed. A few 100,000 people were still in Zimbabwe, and the transition couldn't have been more peaceful. We had some terrible, after effects of the war. Firstly, there were bandits that just didn't come in and refused to be brought into the collection camps when the disarmament and peace was eventually agreed upon. And so we had remnants of that. And in fact, I spoke about that in my last show with Ernst van Zyl, the Conscious Caracal. And so there was some insurgency that continued or lingered, but that was quite quickly stamped out. And then, of course, just after independence in the early 80s, I think 83 or so, then Mugabe committed the genocide against the Matabele, which is commonly now called Gakurahundi, where about 30,000 Matabele people were murdered by a brigade called the 5th Brigade that Mugabe had trained in North Korea. And they came back under a guy called Perence Shiri and committed a kind of vengeful genocide against the Matabele. And those were the two main events that happened post the war, that are a scar on the history of Zimbabwe itself, the independent country of Zimbabwe. But then post that, the 80s and the 90s were absolutely fantastic. Zimbabwe in those times was the best it had ever been, even during Rhodesian times. Of course, it was at peace. Mugabe was relatively stable. The country thrived. The agricultural sector was absolutely at peak performance. There was a very big growing middle class of up and coming Black people, housing estates and developments, new schools, hospitals, services were still good, and it was an abundant place to live. So there was a golden period post independence that we all thought and hoped would last forever. But it did not. And then Mugabe made some critically stupid decisions. One of them was sending the army to Congo to overthrow Mobutu Sese Seko and install the Kabila gang into power. And he did that as a trade-off for mineral resources in the Eastern Congo, which are still being fought over today. And that was initially what bankrupted our country. And then the war veterans from the Civil War, they went on the rampage and demanded a payout and land, and they put a hell of a lot of pressure on Mugabe. And so he emptied the treasury and paid them all $50,000 each, or some sort of figure like that, which basically bankrupted the country. And then from there, it just got worse and worse. And as a result, Mugabe had nothing else to do but to revert to populist tendencies. And of course, that culminated in what is known now as the farm invasions, or the land grab that happened 20 years ago or so in Zimbabwe. So it was a period of absolutely peachy, rosy, fantastic living, where everyone in the country was benefiting. Jobs were being created, tourism was booming, and manufacturing and so on. And then, the imminent decline.
So I've sort of buried the lead here, because you had a very fascinating job working in anti-poaching. But I assume that's not the sort of thing where you just submit your CV and then hear back in a few weeks. So why were you the type of person that got selected for that? And why was that a job that was necessary at the time?
Yes. Okay. So my family were from what is called the 1890 Pioneer Column, where Rhodes assembled a group of people to go in and take over what is called Mashonaland. And that was done in agreement with a Matabele king by the name of Lobengula. And so in the late 1880s, that column of settlers and soldiers, prospectors, miners, farmers, wagon builders, metal workers were assembled, and they trekked with ox wagon and horses and cattle herds up through Matabeleland from South Africa into what is now Botswana, and then into southern Zimbabwe. And in 1890, they took occupation of Mashonaland. And my great-great-grandfather, a guy called Sandy Tullach, he was given rights to explore the eastern border with before it was a border, and before Mozambique and Zimbabwe, there was Portuguese East Africa, and then, in 1890, Rhodesia. And so, it came from the blood of our people and from the experience of our ancestors and our family, because they had to explore and build from scratch. It's quite fascinating. My great-great-grandfather collected a group of Shangaan warriors at the top of what is today Kruger National Park, on the trek north. And those Shangaan guys stuck with him for their entire lives. And they trekked with him all the way to a place that is now called Penhalonga. And Penhalonga was an isolated, unpopulated valley in the hills and mountains of the eastern escarpment of Zimbabwe, where it drops into the coastal lowlands towards the Indian Ocean in Mozambique. And he started prospecting there and panned for gold, and then eventually built what is a massive gold mine that it still exists today, called Red Wing Mine in Penhalonga. And then, of course, those guys, my grandfather included, built what is now the city of Mutare, Amtali as it was then. So obviously we have that in our blood and in our history. And then, of course, my great-grandfather, my grandfather was an explorer. He spent all of his spare time in what is called the Zambezi Valley. He had a passion for the people that lived in the Zambezi Valley, called the Tonga tribe. They, I don't know if you've ever seen the two-toed people of Zimbabwe. They are the Tonga people. And he explored the Zambezi Valley, and in fact was the guy who found the giant fossilized forests there and dinosaur footprints in rocks that he found out there. And he was instrumental in forming the large World Heritage National Parks that run along the lower Zambezi River. And as a result of that, his son, my uncle, my mother's brother, left school and joined national parks as a junior ranger. And by the time I was in my prime, he was the chief warden, the sort of national director of all national parks. And so we grew up during the war, and then in Rhodesia with open access to all of the national parks and heritage, wildlife heritage of Zimbabwe. And because of that, and growing up in the war, we had developed a lot of skill and knowledge on the topography, the terrain, the people, the animals, and how to live, to work, and to fight in that environment.
So what were the skills, what was the skill set that made you good at that job?
Yeah, so, some people tend to be good at being an outdoorsman, and just others fail dismally. But some of the skill sets are understanding the environment and the threats of the environment, everything from where to source water, what is and what is not viable to eat, how to track and understand animal movements, what to do when you encounter lions, buffaloes, elephants, rhinoceros, black mamba, these things, crocodiles, how to cross rivers, how to read spoor, how to tell, how long and how old, human spoor are, how to track people, how to set ambush. It's a huge skill set that is not easy to gather together. It has to be entrenched in you, ingrained in you over many, many years. And because of our background, we just naturally had all those skill sets. Then a terrible thing happened with the the rhinoceros in Zimbabwe. The same Zambezi Valley that my grandfather helped form into what are today World Heritage National Parks was the last remaining large viable population of black rhinoceros in the world. And as kids, we used to regularly run into them just going fishing. And, my cousin and I had to hide several times behind a tree while an angry black rhino, fortunately, they've got very bad eyesight and they quickly cool off. But yeah, so we knew and have been charged by buffalo, elephant, rhinos all our lives. But the Chinese and the Yemeni, the Arabs had a passion for rhinoceros horn in the Middle East to make daggers, dagger handles, which is a traditional, customary rite of passage. When you get that big curved dagger, they used rhino horn for the handles, and then of course the Chinese for their medicine. And of course, weapons were easy to get. The civil wars in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and the Congo ensured that there was no shortage of arms and heavy weaponry. And then gangs of poachers and former insurgents started, crossing the Zambezi River and slaughtering rhinos. And as a result of that, there was actually a thing called the Rhino Wars. And actually, we were in a National Geographic documentary. If you look up in the archives of National Geographic, you will see there is a couple of videos made by National Geographic about my uncle and about our fight against the losing battle with the fight against the poaching to save the black rhino. And I'm sad to say that today not a single one exists in the Zambezi Valley. They killed every single one.
So you've mentioned, both that these poachers were heavily armed, and you mentioned that skills like setting an ambush were required. And I think in the West, the term poaching is sort of quaint. You imagine someone fishing in a stream out of season, or taking a deer after sunset, something which is technically illegal, but let's be honest, rather harmless. And so we're and again, you've mentioned the Rhino Wars, but was this a violent affair? Was this something dangerous?
Your own Navy SEALs joined us in that fight. We had weapons of war there. It was an actual war. It was a mini war in a localized area, but it was extremely deadly and violent. We lost a lot of people, and many poachers were killed in the endeavor to save the black rhino. And of course, the secondary product that they go after is ivory. No, it was deadly. My uncle at that time sat on what is called the JOC committee, the Joint Operational Command, that is with Army, Air Force, intelligence, police, and so on. He was a member of the Joint Command at the time in the country, and the war against poaching had a shoot to kill policy that was endorsed by the national government. So it was deadly, it was very dangerous, and the terrain is some of the harshest in the world, because in summertime when it's raining, you're talking about an area of hundreds of thousands. I think perhaps I think in kilometers, but perhaps 100,000 square kilometers. And absolutely wild. So there's in the dry, we have a wet and dry season. It's tropical Africa. So in the wet season, there's water everywhere. You can't get vehicles in. You get stuck. We have the soil called black cotton soil in the Mopani forests. You have the threat of wild animals at all times, particularly the big five and the big seven, if you add hippos and crocodiles. And then, of course, you've got the human element, the danger of the poachers themselves, who were ruthless, fitter, more determined, and more dangerous than we were too, because they had nothing to leave. You're talking about people that are just criminally intent on getting what they wanted at the cost of even their lives. And so there were many contacts and shootouts with those guys. We had military helicopters. We had air gunships, helicopter gunships. We had the highest tech that the Americans could give us through the Navy SEALs, who were also deployed to help us, amongst other specialist groups. And a lot of the guys in the national parks were former special forces guys brought in to try and end the poaching, but we failed. And it was deeply saddening that the world allows those kind of things to happen,
So what is, if you could, sort of an anecdote you could tell to my audience to sort of describe what that was like, going out, looking for poachers? It doesn't need to be something long, but just something you remember as sort of, representative of that time.
So there was this group of poachers that we were tracking, and they were heading east inland towards what is called the Zambezi Escarpment, and they had killed a rhino and hacked its horn off. And we were about half a day behind them, and we were running on their spoor, and eventually we caught them resting and sitting under a tree, and by surprise we just they appeared in front of us, and we immediately opened fire on them, and we managed to shoot two of the three, but a third one, he got away and almost killed one of our guys in that firefight. And so we then went in pursuit of this guy, but we knew that he was injured because there was a lot of blood on his spoor. So we were certain that we would get him sooner or later, or that we would find him bleeding out. But that fellow took us the entire rest of that day, through the night, and the next day they were in the escarpment in a ravine that he had gone up into this ravine, and that same chap that we'd been chasing for 2 days, he was severely wounded. We knew that he set an ambush for us on his own, and the only thing that saved us from him mowing us down was that he only had the use of one hand. And so as soon as he opened up with his machine gun, the barrel jumped into the air and took everything but the first shot way above us. And then one of the game scouts, I think it was a guy called Manuel Guy, shot him with an FN 7.62 straight through the head. But when we went to inspect his body, we found that his Achilles tendon had been shot off, and his left wrist had been shot through by 7.62 military grade rounds. And this chap had stopped in the night, and using an old bicycle inner tube, had wrapped his own leg and his Achilles in a very, very tight bind with this rubber, and went on to ambush us. And that just gives an example of how tough these guys are.
Well, and all specifics aside, you sort of have to respect how much of a game fighter you have to be to go through that and still have the spirit to set up an ambush. So
without a doubt, you're talking about hard men. You know, we in the Western world, and I mean, I'm not a Westerner, I'm an African guy, but you know, my mom lives in Florida, for example. My daughter is a policewoman in the London Met, so I do know what goes on in the rest of the world, and you know, there's just nothing like it. There's nothing in Europe or North America that is quite as tough as a wild African man who just is totally in tune with his environment. These guys seem impervious to pain. They're able to their threshold for most things, for discomfort and hunger and thirst, the ability to continue on when all of us would collapse. You know, so they are an incredible enemy to face, and just fortunately, we just have a lot more discipline and training in terms of how to use our equipment and a little bit more technology. And it's only that really gave us an advantage. But, you know, one-on-one, yeah, it's you or him, and quite often it would be him, not you.
So I'm deliberately trying to avoid topics that you spoke to Ernst about. Mostly
Sure.
because I'm going to include that link in the description. I recommend everyone check out that interview. It's quite good.
Thank
But
you.
you know, you mentioned your kit, and the majority of that podcast is taken up with, you know, a long discussion about, you know, this multi-month long mission you were on. And so, to me, I was just curious. One, you know, what was your kit like? What was your resupply like? And how much were you bringing with you as you know, go through this incredibly difficult terrain?
Yeah. So, you know, I did. I led a couple of military training exercises with American forces, British, Austrian, Italian special forces guys, where I used to run a, excuse me, a type of venture training program for them, where I would take them and we'd go off into the wilderness and harden them up a bit, and teach them what it would be like if they fell out of an aeroplane into, you know, the middle of the African bush. And um, so, you know, with those things, conventionally, you think about taking, you know, dehydrated food, perhaps, you know, cereals, powdered milk, that sort of thing. But when you are doing it African style, our kit was a relatively good military kit in terms of your packs and your webbing and your, you know, your rifle or your weaponry. But that's kind of where it ended. I carried a bit of medical stuff, you know, mostly for, you know, heavy wounds, cuts, gashes, breaks, and puncture stabs and shots, you know, gunshot wounds. I would carry what I could, but space, of course, is a major concern. So you don't really carry extra clothing. You wear a pair of shorts under a pair of trousers. You wear a vest and a shirt and a jacket and a hat. And then we would carry what we call out in that part of the world sadza, or maize meal, mealie meal. You would call it cornmeal over your side. And that's a staple diet. And so each one member of the stick would carry a decent weight of that, 5 to 7 kilograms per person. And then each person would carry fresh meat, which we would get at a rural village or at a rural butchery. And that fresh meat was just wrapped in brown wax paper and stuffed into the top of the pack. Then, of course, you've got your little small bottle of oil. We used to take dehydrated dried cabbage, um, which was quite good. We would take tea bags and brown sugar, no milk. We would carry a lot of hard candy, or sweets as we call them here, as a treat and for energy. We would take a few rehydration salt tablets with us. We used to use the old 35 millimeter plastic um, camera rolls, those little plastic containers, and fill those up with, if for example, with a little bit of chili or a little bit of spice of some sort to make meals more interesting. But yeah, it was very basic. And on the first night, we would make the stiff maize porridge, and we would roast on a smokeless fire the first day's meat, and then we would build a green twig structure over the fire, and then we would heap the meat on there overnight and allow it to smoke as we slept. And then very early in the morning, we would simply eat any leftover of the porridge with a bit of sugar and have a cup of tea, and then a black tea, black sweet tea, and then we would pack that all up and go. And that red meat bush diet would last us as long as 14 to 15 days, because every day you're smoking it, and by the end you're eating the most delicious smoked beef you've ever had in your life. And of course, the further you get from civilization, the more fantastic anything you eat tastes. So yeah, that's how we did it, and that's the kind of Black African way. And in those times, I didn't operate with white people. I was the only white guy involved in any of that. Most of the guys I worked with were Black African soldiers, you know.
So you mentioned earlier, using the FN 308, right? The FAL as it's called in the US. But what else were you armed with, and what was the opposition carrying? I assume mostly communist bloc gear for the poachers, correct?
Yeah, so we had AK-47s as well. The FN 762 or FAL, the Fabrica Nationale, made in Belgium. That was the finest of any of those developed. And then the MAG 762 light machine gun. And that was pretty much it, and occasionally sidearms.
I'm guessing light is a relative term for a machine gun you have to carry for 15 days through the jungle, right?
Yeah, no, it's a heavy bloody thing. I think, it must weigh best part of 20 pounds. And then, all the belts of ammo for it. So your machine gun is normally a big boy, and ours was a guy called Elijah. And he was a very, very big, strong man. It's quite an unwieldy thing. But the guys who get to know how to shoot those things can eventually shoot them from the hip and become very accurate and very, very effective with them. And otherwise, it was mostly AKs and the FN 762. And then, yes, the poachers were predominantly using AK-47s, but also in some cases heavy caliber hunting rifles, particularly when you're shooting things like rhinos. So they would acquire those, and then there were other Chinese weapons such as the SKS, and occasionally you would find some variants. They also had a machine gun, a PKM, I think it was called, and so that was pretty standard across Africa. We the Rhodesian stock, if you like, from the war was often the Belgian manufactured stuff, and then some stuff from South Africa.
So to me, my biggest question was simply, how did you find anyone? You mentioned tracking, but obviously, I believe you said it was 100,000 square kilometers. And I mean, even if there's 1,000 people there, it'd be very, very difficult to find them, especially assuming they didn't want to be caught. So what were your techniques there, and what were the things that clued you into the presence of poachers?
Yeah, okay. So firstly, you got to know the lay of the land and understand the topography, geology, and the water, how the water systems work out there. And the only way that you ever get in touch with gangs of poachers, the hard way around, which is what we did, was you simply have to spend all your time patrolling until such time as you come across signs and spoor. And there's a number of ways in which that happens. For example, you're always too late when you see vultures circling in the sky. But you know, the strangest thing about the wilderness is that if you become attuned to the wilderness, anything that is out of the ordinary sticks out like a sore thumb. And so a footprint, a broken branch, perhaps the way the grass has been swept in a certain way, will tell you that it's people or it's an animal or it's an unusual, it's an anomaly. But most often we would get on the trail of poachers through finding them the hard way by having continuous patrols and in sectors. And then the other one was OPs, observation points, the high ground, watching the rivers, watching for signs of people crossing in dugout canoes, looking for fire, flame, smoke. Yeah, numerous ways. But you know, the rule of thumb is you've got to be there and you've got to spend the time on the ground, and you've got to swarm the area with as many personnel as you can. And of course, with that landscape and the scale of it, as you said quite rightly, that's very difficult. Occasionally, you would even hear gunshots and then run towards that. And yeah.
So, what were the poachers' motivations, and what were they looking for? You know, you've mentioned that it was, you know, black rhinos were quite a prize. They'd hack off the horns. But were there other animals they went for? And then how did they manage to transport their kills out of the country?
Yeah, so we'll talk specifically to, for example, the Rhino War or the poaching in the Zambezi Valley. That whole stretch of land I'm talking about shares a border with Zambia and has the mighty Zambezi River splitting it in two. Now, on the Zimbabwean side, as I said earlier, my grandfather and his people established these huge national parks that literally run the entire length of the border with Zambia, which is a very, very long border. Don't quote me, but 1,000 kilometers perhaps. And the majority of the Zimbabwean side is sanctuaries for wildlife and natural ecosystems. Then the Zambian side was a mixture of national parks and tribal areas. And as a result, there were people living right on the riverbanks with opposite the Zimbabwean border with the Zambezi River in between. And that's no joke. That river is 2-3 kilometers wide in places. It's a huge major river up there with the Nile and the Congo and the Zambezi. It's one of the major rivers. And Zambia was extremely corrupt. It was run then by a guy called Kenneth Kaunda. I think he was in power there for 25 years or so. And he had a lot of influence there from Chinese, Vietnamese, people coming in, people in the embassies. Ordinarily, it was the Asian embassies, the Chinese, Vietnamese embassies that would initiate the industry of exporting this illicit product, i.e. rhino horn, ivory, pangolin shells, the scaly anteater. The scales of that thing is also part of their traditional medicine in Asia somehow. And it goes right down to, various tortoises, geckos, sharks, shark fins. Oh, it's the list is long of natural resources that they plunder for the Chinese natural or mystical medicinal, um, um, traditional, medicine. And so it's pretty easy. There were big bosses up in Lusaka, mostly Chinese and Vietnamese, as we knew then, and they would then work in cahoots with Zambian politicians, chiefs, and businessmen, and who would then, gather together these little mercenary groups that would make raids into Zimbabwe to hunt rhinos and elephants. And then of course those poor folks, we would shoot them if we saw them, and many of them died, but many of them got back with rhino horn and with ivory, and that then is handed to the middleman, who hands it to the Chinese guy, and then that goes in a diplomatic pouch, which is of course sealed and not liable for search by customs and excise in Zambia, by diplomatic, decree. And so that's how it all got out, was on airplanes directly to the Far East. And it's easy and relatively easy to compact to carry. Of course, elephant ivory is a lot bigger and more bulky. But those people down there are tribal people. They've been living on that river for thousands of years. They make giant canoes out of big old fig trees that they cut down and hack out with various hand tools. And those, they're very skilled at using those. And so they would paddle themselves back and forth from Zambia to Zimbabwe, taking their loot with them.
That's fascinating. So what brought you out of this line of work, and what are you currently doing?
Well, I stayed in that line of work, and then it just got more intense because I got more into the intelligence, side of things, and working for various organizations and governments. I worked for the Office of the President in Zambia. I worked for the Ministry of State for Presidential Affairs in Zimbabwe. I even worked for a year and a half during the Mozambique Civil War with the Frelimo, the ruling party in Mozambique under Samora Machel. Eventually, I got out of it because a white man in Africa running around in African intelligence circles becomes eventually a very unwise. Yes. So I've always had farming in my roots. So in various chapters of my life, I was in, conservation and anti-poaching, but always twinned with a day job, which was either tourism. I built a couple of lodges and managed those in pristine areas. And then I also had a hand in commercial farming of deciduous fruit up in the Eastern Highlands, also where I lived when I was, talking to Ernst about that area. It was in that area. And yeah, so that's always stood me in good stead, is being able to fall back on my conservation, come tourism and agricultural background. And as a result of that, I eventually gained some, good respect for my project management skills. And I built some private estates for some very wealthy people, and looked after, how, the ecological aspect of the estate, and designing and redesigning the layer of the land, building, buildings for them, and pubs and restaurants and hotel rooms and these kind of things. And then eventually I left Zimbabwe to come to South Africa when it became impossible to stay, and unsafe for me and my son to stay in Zimbabwe. And because of that, we literally fled overnight to South Africa. And when I did that, I had a real life-changing time. I had to make some real deep personal choices then, and that was to continue in this kind of roguish, slightly undercover world, in intelligence and, man hunting and that kind of thing. And so about a decade ago, I said, okay, that's the end of that. I will now pursue what I am as my root and my culture, and that is to get back on the land and to focus solely on that. And so it's been a long journey, but today I am a medicinal plants entrepreneur in the medicinal plants space, and I live in what is called the Klein Karoo, or the Little Karoo, in the Western Cape of South Africa. It's a semi-desert area, extremely beautiful, surrounded by high mountains in the floral kingdom of the Cape. And here grows a little succulent plant, a desert plant called Scaletium. And out of that, we have learned how to manufacture an extracted component of that, which we now utilize in antidepressant and as a solution to various mental disorders, ADHD, autism, addiction, and so on. And so it's a very, very interesting journey because it involved learning how to commercially farm a wild plant and then learn how to make viable, standardized medical solutions or supplement solutions out of that. And then, of course, prove that scientifically and then launch it as a product to the world. So we are soon launching in America, and we are also now doing business with the EU and the UK. And we've launched products in Africa here that are doing a marvelous job as an alternative to things like Ritalin and Concerta and these strange big pharma drugs that people take for depression that everyone seems to be hooked on.
Well, again, Rory, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, I'm on X as Rory Duncan with a whole lot of random numbers after Rory Duncan. My profile picture is on there. You'll recognize me as a big fat white guy. And then there's just a couple of shows with Ernst van Sale and yourself. That's that. And then, of course, we have our websites, which you can look up. I'll post those on X. So you can look in my history. I have quite a bit of content there on X, which highlights the work that we do.
And again, thank you so much, Rory. It's been a great conversation. I'm
absolutely honored.
As far as my stuff, you can find The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. In addition, you can find me on Substack. I have a new article linked in the description. As well, you can support us directly by checking out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Really good work with the guys there. And again, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.